The Black Hollow train station had been abandoned for decades, its forgotten silhouette standing like a ghost in the small, decaying town that bore the same name. The station's once bustling walls were now covered in graffiti and vines, the once pristine windows smeared with grime, making it nearly impossible to see inside. The tracks had long since rusted over, the platforms empty save for the occasional rat scurrying across. For most people, the station was just a relic of a bygone era, an eerie reminder of a time when the town thrived. But for some, there was something far more sinister about Black Hollow Station, something deeply unsettling that lingered in the air, especially when night fell. Abigail Turner, a sharp-eyed and determined investigative journalist, arrived in Black Hollow after hearing rumors of the strange occurrences surrounding the station. She was used to chasing down mysterious leads, and her work often revolved around unraveling unsolved mysteries, urban legends, and strange happenings. But Black Hollow had an atmosphere that felt different, even to someone as seasoned as Abigail. It wasn't just a creepy old station. It seemed to breathe with an unsettling life of its own. Townspeople claimed that the station was haunted, but not by the typical apparitions. There were whispers of passengers still waiting for a train that never arrived, glimpses of shadowy figures in the fog, and most disturbing of all, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the dilapidated structure, Abigail prepared to begin her investigation. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, her notebook, and a camera, she stepped onto the platform. The air around her was unusually still, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked stone beneath her, each one reverberating in the eerie silence. She felt a cold breeze, though the air was otherwise stagnant, and a prickling sensation crept up the back of her neck. She paused for a moment, scanning her surroundings. There was no one else here, or at least no one visible. The deeper Abigail ventured into the station, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in on her, as if the building itself was aware of her presence, reacting to her intrusion. She approached the edge of the platform and peered into the dense fog that seemed to roll in unnaturally fast as dusk gave way to night. Then she saw movement in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat as she squinted to get a clearer view. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but then the figures became clearer. Shadowy, indistinct forms were walking along the tracks, their outlines barely visible through the mist. Abigail raised her camera, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to focus the lens. As she clicked the shutter, the figures suddenly stopped. For a chilling second, they seemed to turn in unison, facing her. Her heart pounded in her chest. These weren't just shadows. They were people, or at least they appeared to be. But there was something terribly wrong about them. Their faces were blurred, almost as if they were trapped between realities, their bodies flickering in and out of focus like a broken projection. Abigail blinked, her mind racing as she tried to rationalize what she was seeing, but nothing about this made sense. Suddenly, the figures started to move again, but this time, they weren't just aimlessly wandering. They were walking toward her, their forms becoming more distinct with each step. Panic surged through Abigail as she stumbled backward, her instincts screaming at her to run. The fog thickened, swallowing the figures whole just as they reached the platform, leaving Abigail alone once again. The oppressive silence returned, more terrifying than ever. She stood there, breathless, her heart pounding as she clutched her camera tightly. There was no way to explain what she had just witnessed, but one thing was clear. There was something unnatural about Black Hollow Station. Something had been awakened, and Abigail was no longer sure if she was the hunter or the hunted. The days following Abigail's first visit to Black Hollow Station were filled with a restless, gnawing feeling that she couldn't shake. She found herself replaying the events in her mind over and over again, trying to make sense of the ghostly figures she had seen in the mist. Their blurred faces, the way they seemed to move with purpose toward her, left her questioning what was real and what was a trick of her mind. But deep down, she knew what she had seen wasn't just a product of her imagination. There was something at that station, something waiting to be discovered. Despite the fear that had gripped her during her initial visit, Abigail was determined to return. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was by facing whatever was hiding in the shadows of Black Hollow. The next evening, she gathered her equipment, a stronger flashlight, an audio recorder, and her camera, before making her way back to the station. The sun was setting again, casting an orange glow over the desolate landscape, and once more, an eerie silence enveloped the area. The town seemed even more deserted than before, and Abigail noticed that even the few locals she'd seen previously had disappeared from the streets as the darkness crept in. As she approached the station, the thick fog that had unnerved her before started to roll in once again, as if it were waiting for her. The mist clung to the air, swirling around her legs as she walked onto the platform. Every footstep echoed ominously, amplifying the profound isolation of the place. The cold, biting breeze returned, sending a shiver down her spine, though it was a calm evening otherwise. Abigail couldn't help but feel as though she was crossing into some otherworldly threshold, one where the rules of time and space no longer applied. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Stepping closer to the edge of the platform, she focused on the tracks that vanished into the dense fog, half expecting the same shadowy figures to appear. For a few moments, nothing happened. The station was still, almost oppressively so. Then, from somewhere deep within the fog, a faint, rhythmic sound broke the silence, the unmistakable clicking of footsteps on the platform. Her heart pounded as she swung her flashlight in the direction of the sound. At first, there was only the mist, thick and unyielding, but then there they were. Silhouettes. Not one, but several figures were moving toward her, gliding silently along the platform. Abigail stood frozen, gripping her flashlight so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The figures, indistinct and ghostly, moved as if in slow motion, their heads slightly bowed as they walked. Abigail squinted, her pulse quickening as she tried to make out their features. But just like the night before, their faces were a blur, shifting and warping in the dim light. She raised her camera again, the trembling in her hands making it difficult to hold steady. The flash briefly illuminated the scene, and for a split second, she saw them clearly. Men and women in old-fashioned clothing, their faces unnervingly blank. They were dressed as if from different eras, some in tattered Victorian coats, others in faded 1950s dresses, but all shared the same hollow, empty expressions. It was as if they weren't fully there, trapped in a liminal space between past and present, between life and death. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped moving. A woman, her hair long and matted, stood unnaturally still just a few feet away from Abigail. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Then, without warning, the woman's face twisted, her empty eyes locking onto Abigail's. It was as if she had become aware of her presence for the first time, and in that moment, something changed. Abigail's breath hitched as the woman took a single, deliberate step toward her. The air around them seemed to grow colder, thick with an unseen weight. The rest of the figures continued to drift past, oblivious to Abigail, but the woman, she was different. She was staring directly at her now, and the intensity of that empty gaze sent a wave of dread crashing through Abigail's body. Her legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, unable to move despite every instinct screaming at her to run. In a desperate attempt to break the spell, Abigail flicked off her flashlight and stumbled back, her mind racing. As soon as the light disappeared, so did the figures. They dissolved into the fog, vanishing as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Abigail alone once more in the suffocating silence. The platform was empty, but the lingering sense of being watched persisted, stronger than ever. Her heart still racing, she took one final look at the tracks, hoping for any sign of normalcy. But the station remained shrouded in fog, as if it had swallowed the figures whole. Abigail knew she couldn't leave things as they were. Whatever haunted this station had noticed her, and she could feel it creeping closer with every visit. She had to know more. But even as she gathered her things and hurried back into the night, one thought gnawed at the back of her mind. She might not be the only one doing the watching. The nights after Abigail's second visit to Black Hollow Station were restless, filled with the unnerving sensation that something was lurking just beyond her reach. Sleep, when it came, was fractured, as though her mind was constantly straddling the line between wakefulness and a dream that was too real. She found herself trapped in vivid nightmares, always back at the station. In her dreams, the platform was consumed by fog, thick and suffocating, and she stood in the middle of it, unable to move. Shadowy figures, the same blurred apparitions she had seen before, wandered around her in a slow, steady loop. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, and their whispers, always too soft to fully understand, crawled into her ears, making her blood run cold. Every night, the dreams were the same. She would try to leave, but her feet were glued to the ground, frozen in place as the figures moved closer. The faces were never clear, always shifting like smoke, but their presence was heavy, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. They would circle her, their whispers growing louder, filling her head until it felt like she might scream. Then, just as one of them would reach out to touch her, she would jolt awake, her heart racing, drenched in cold sweat. The room around her would be pitch dark, silent except for her own frantic breaths, but the sensation of being watched lingered long after the dream had ended. It wasn't just the nightmares that unsettled Abigail. During the day, strange things began happening in her apartment. At first, it was small, almost dismissible. Items slightly out of place, drawers left open when she was certain she had closed them. But soon, the disturbances escalated. One morning, she woke up to find a thick layer of dust covering her desk, even though she had wiped it clean the day before. As she stood there, staring at the dust, a chilling realization crept over her. The dust wasn't just scattered randomly. It formed the distinct outline of handprints. Someone or something had been there while she slept. That night, the nightmare returned, but this time it was worse. The whispers were louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to tell her something, but the words were garbled, slipping through her consciousness like water through fingers. The fog was thicker, too, making it nearly impossible to see beyond her immediate surroundings. The figures that wandered the platform were no longer just passing shadows in the distance. They were closer, more defined, their movements more deliberate. She could almost make out their features now. Hollow eyes, twisted expressions, faces frozen in anguish. The sound of their footsteps was deafening, as if each step was an echo from another time. Abigail's pulse raced as she stood frozen in the dream, unable to tear her gaze away from the figures. Then, from the far end of the platform, she saw him, a man in a long, dark coat. Unlike the others, who drifted aimlessly, this figure moved with purpose. He walked toward her, his head slightly bowed, his face obscured by the brim of an old-fashioned hat. There was something about him that set her teeth on edge, a presence so profoundly wrong that it made the air around her vibrate with dread. He stopped a few feet away, just far enough for her to see his hand lift from his side. In his grasp was a pocket watch, its chain swinging gently as he clicked it open and shut with mechanical precision. She tried to scream, but no sound came. She wanted to run, to force her legs to move, but the ground beneath her seemed to hold her in place. The man didn't speak. He only stood there, watching her, the metallic click of the watch echoing in the vast emptiness. Time felt distorted, stretched out as if minutes were passing in seconds, or perhaps the other way around. His presence weighed on her, pressing against her chest like an invisible hand squeezing her heart. And then, just as he began to take a step closer, the dream shattered, and she woke up with a sharp gasp. Her room was dark, but something was different this time. The air felt colder, and as she blinked, trying to steady her breath, she noticed something that made her blood turn to ice. On the window pane, just inches from where she lay, were faint, dusty handprints, the same as she had seen on her desk. But these weren't random smudges. These were deliberate, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass, staring in at her while she slept. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, adrenaline surging through her veins. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling, and illuminated the room with its screen. Nothing. There was no one there. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and oppressive. She stood up, her body on edge, and slowly approached the window. The handprints were real, clear as day, but there were no signs of anyone outside. The streets below were empty, and the night was eerily quiet, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. Abigail backed away from the window, her mind racing. She had to find out what was happening. She couldn't live like this, trapped between the waking world and the nightmare that seemed to be bleeding into her reality. Determined to find answers, she resolved to return to Black Hollow Station. The dream, the handprints, the figures, they were all connected. Something in that station had reached out to her, and now was pulling her deeper into its grasp. She felt as though she was standing on the edge of something dark and unknowable, but she had no choice but to dive in. Whatever was haunting Black Hollow wasn't done with her yet. Abigail felt a sense of dread as she prepared to return to Black Hollow Station, though she refused to let it show. She wasn't just a curious journalist anymore. This had become personal. The nightmares, the handprints, the feeling of being watched even in her own home. It was all connected to that place, and she was going to uncover the truth no matter how dangerous it might be. Armed with her camera, audio recorder, and a flashlight stronger than before, she made her way back to the station at dusk, knowing that whatever was haunting her thrived in the shadows. As she approached the station, it looked more ominous than ever. The structure loomed like a skeletal husk, its windows still dark and clouded with grime, the air heavy with the oppressive silence that seemed to envelop everything around it. The fog had already begun to form, swirling lazily around the tracks and platforms, as if the station were breathing it out, a living entity unto itself. Abigail steeled herself, knowing that this time she would go deeper into the heart of the mystery. Stepping onto the platform, she immediately felt the atmosphere shift. The temperature dropped, the stillness becoming suffocating, like the weight of the unseen pressing down on her chest. Her flashlight flickered slightly as she aimed it at the empty tracks ahead, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked stone. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, as if the station was amplifying the sound to remind her how alone she was. But she wasn't alone. Not really. She could feel it again, that unmistakable sensation of being watched, as though eyes from another world were fixed on her every movement. The fog thickened around her, and she heard something faint, a whispering sound, just barely audible. It wasn't coming from the station itself, but from the tracks, deep in the fog. Abigail followed the sound, her pulse quickening. She reached for her audio recorder and pressed record, hoping to capture whatever voices might be lurking in the mist. As she walked further, the whispering grew louder, though she still couldn't make out any distinct words. The voices seemed to echo, overlapping one another, creating a strange, ghostly chorus that made her skin crawl. It was as if they were trying to communicate with her, but were trapped, their words lost in the void. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by a soft metallic click, the sound of a pocket watch. Abigail froze, her eyes wide with recognition. The man from her dreams. She turned slowly, scanning the fog, her flashlight beam cutting through the haze. There, emerging from the mist, was the same figure she had seen in her nightmare. A man in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of an old-fashioned hat. His presence sent a jolt of terror through her, but she forced herself to stay calm, to watch him closely. The man walked slowly, deliberately, the faint click of the pocket watch punctuating each step. He didn't seem to notice her at first, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest as she raised her camera, snapping photos as quickly as she could. But the man didn't react. He moved toward the platform's edge, where the tracks disappeared into the fog, and stopped. He stood there, staring down at the tracks as if waiting for something, or someone. Abigail swallowed hard and took a step closer. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound brave. The man didn't answer. He remained perfectly still, his back turned to her, his head tilted slightly down as though listening for something. The fog swirled around him, making it hard to tell where he ended and the mist began. The metallic click of the pocket watch continued, rhythmic and unnerving. Abigail took another step closer. "Why are you here?" she asked, louder this time, hoping to provoke some kind of response. Then, without warning, the man turned toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. His face was hidden in shadow, but Abigail could see his hand moving, lifting the pocket watch from his coat. He clicked it open, and in that moment, a deep, resonant voice seemed to echo through the station, though his lips didn't move. "They never left." The words reverberated through Abigail's mind, chilling her to the core. Before she could react, the man's form began to blur, dissolving into the fog like smoke caught in the wind. One moment he was there, solid and real, and the next he was gone, leaving only the suffocating silence in his wake. Abigail stood there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind spinning with questions. What did he mean? Who were they? She turned to leave, her instincts telling her to get out, but something stopped her. The whispering returned, louder now, coming from the station itself. Abigail turned back toward the building, her flashlight illuminating the cracked walls and rusted doors. And then, just beyond the boarded-up ticket booth, she saw them, figures, dozens of them, moving through the fog. They weren't as distinct as the man, but their presence was undeniable. They drifted aimlessly, some clutching bags, others huddled together as if waiting for something. It was as though they were trapped in some endless loop, forever stuck in a moment that never came to an end. Her legs trembled, and she took a step backward, her mind screaming for her to run. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. These weren't just ghosts, they were passengers. The passengers the man had spoken of, the ones who never left. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as one of the figures turned toward her, its face a blurred mask of sorrow and confusion. It raised a hand, reaching out as if pleading for help. The others began to turn as well, their empty gazes fixing on her, their whispers intensifying into a cacophony of desperate, disembodied voices. Abigail stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. They were coming toward her, slowly at first, but with a growing urgency, their hollow eyes filled with a silent cry for release. Panic surged through her as she spun around and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. The fog seemed to close in around her, thickening as she sprinted toward the exit. The whispers followed her, growing louder, the voices overlapping in a terrifying, unintelligible chorus. She didn't stop until she was clear of the station, the oppressive weight lifting the moment she crossed the threshold. Gasping for breath, Abigail looked back one last time. The station stood silent, the fog curling lazily around its edges, as though nothing had ever happened. But she knew better. Something was wrong with that place. Something deeply, horrifyingly wrong. The passengers weren't just ghosts. They were trapped souls, bound to the station for reasons she still didn't understand. And she feared that whatever force held them there had no intention of letting them, or her go. Abigail barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the whispers seemed to fill her head, like a relentless tide washing over her thoughts. The figures, the passengers, appeared behind her eyelids, their blurry faces frozen in an eternal plea for help. She tossed and turned in her bed, the oppressive weight of the station's presence hanging over her even miles away from Black Hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her home, but the station wasn't done with her yet. The next morning, she sat at her desk, staring at the photographs she had taken. Her hands trembled as she clicked through each image, hoping they would reveal something tangible, something that could explain the nightmare she was living. But the photos were grainy and unclear, the figures in the mist nothing more than vague shapes. There was no sign of the man with the pocket watch, no clear evidence of the ghostly passengers. Frustration gnawed at her. How could something that felt so real be reduced to a series of blurry, useless pictures? Her phone buzzed on the desk, startling her from her thoughts. It was a text from a friend, Sarah, a local historian Abigail had confided in about the station. Sarah had been researching the history of Black Hollow ever since Abigail's first visit, trying to uncover anything that might explain the hauntings. The message was brief but urgent. Found something? Meet me at the library. It's important. Abigail wasted no time, throwing on her coat and heading to the town's library, her mind racing with possibilities. She had hoped Sarah might find something, some clue to the station's dark history. But now that she was on her way, a part of her was almost afraid to learn the truth. The station's presence had been growing stronger each day, seeping into her life, her thoughts, her dreams. She feared what might happen if she uncovered the full extent of its power. When Abigail arrived at the library, Sarah was waiting in one of the private study rooms, a stack of old newspapers and documents spread out in front of her. Her expression was grim, and Abigail's stomach twisted with unease. "What did you find?" she asked, pulling up a chair beside her. Sarah slid a yellowed newspaper clipping across the table. The headline read, "Mysterious train crash at Black Hollow Station. All passengers missing, presumed dead." Abigail's heart skipped a beat as she scanned the article. It was dated over 70 years ago, long before the station had been closed. According to the report, a train bound for Black Hollow had derailed just outside the station under mysterious circumstances. The train had been full of passengers, but when rescuers arrived, the carriages were empty. No bodies were ever found, no survivors, nothing but the wreckage of the train and a chilling silence. The authorities had chalked it up to a freak accident, but rumors had swirled for years about what had really happened that night. Some claimed the passengers had simply vanished. Others believed they had been pulled into another dimension, trapped between worlds. The article ended with a single, ominous line. The passengers were never seen again. Abigail felt her blood run cold. "They never left," she whispered, echoing the words the man with the pocket watch had spoken at the station. Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "There's more," she said, pulling out another document, a faded blueprint of the station itself. "This is a map of Black Hollow, drawn up just after it was built. But look at this." She pointed to a section beneath the station, where a series of tunnels and rooms had been sketched. These tunnels were never used, officially at least. They were supposed to connect the station to other parts of the rail system, but they were abandoned during construction. Some say they were sealed off, forgotten. But what if they weren't? Abigail's heart raced as she studied the blueprint. The tunnels ran deep beneath the station, twisting and turning like a labyrinth. "You think those tunnels are connected to what's happening?" Sarah shrugged, but her eyes were wide with the same fear Abigail felt. "I don't know, but it's strange, isn't it? The passengers disappear, and now you're seeing them at the station, as if they're still waiting for a train that will never come. And then there are these tunnels sealed off, forgotten, but maybe still there." Abigail leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. The pieces were falling into place, but they formed a picture she was terrified to face. The passengers hadn't just died in the crash. They were trapped, caught between the world of the living and the dead, unable to move on. And the station, Black Hollow itself, was holding them there, tethering them to a place that existed outside of time. But why? Why the station? What had happened in those tunnels? "I have to go back," Abigail said, her voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what they meant. She had to return to the station, to go deeper than she had before, to find the tunnels and see what lay hidden beneath the surface. The thought terrified her, but she knew she couldn't walk away now. The passengers were trapped, their souls bound to Black Hollow, and she was the only one who had come close to understanding why. She couldn't just leave them there, abandoned in that endless fog. Sarah looked at her, concern flickering in her eyes. "Are you sure? Whatever's happening there, it's dangerous, Abigail. You've seen what it can do." "I know," Abigail said, her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. "But I can't stop now. Not after everything. I need to know the truth, and I think the answer is in those tunnels." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come with you." "No," Abigail said quickly, shaking her head. "I need to do this alone. I don't know what's down there, and I can't risk dragging anyone else into this." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but she understood. Abigail had to face this on her own. The station had chosen her, whether she liked it or not, and now it was pulling her deeper into its dark web of mystery. Later that evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, Abigail found herself standing once more in front of Black Hollow Station. The fog had already begun to creep in, curling around the edges of the platform like ghostly fingers reaching for her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead, and stepped onto the platform. The station was silent, but Abigail could feel it watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. She walked to the far end of the platform, where the blueprint had shown an entrance to the tunnels, long since sealed off. But as she ran her hand along the cracked wall, she felt a strange warmth beneath her fingertips. The wall wasn't solid, it was hollow, heart-pounding. Abigail grabbed the crowbar she had brought with her and began prying at the edges of the wall. The bricks gave way more easily than she expected, as though they had been waiting for her. With a final heave, the wall crumbled, revealing a dark, gaping hole that led into the earth beneath the station. The tunnel yawned before her, the air inside thick and musty. Abigail swallowed her fear, switched on her flashlight, and stepped into the darkness. The station and the lost souls within it were calling her deeper into its mystery, and this time, there would be no turning back. The tunnel swallowed Abigail whole as she stepped into the darkness beneath Black Hollow Station. The narrow passage felt suffocating, the air thick and stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Her flashlight beam cut through the blackness, casting long shadows on the walls, which were damp and cracked, covered in layers of grime. The faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere in the distance, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Every step she took reverberated through the tunnel, as if the earth itself were amplifying the sound, warning her that she was trespassing in a place she didn't belong. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving. The blueprint Sarah had shown her suggested that these tunnels ran deep beneath the station, connecting to long-forgotten sections of the railway that had never been completed. As she descended further, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something far older and more malevolent than just an abandoned station. The station wasn't just haunted, it was a gateway, a place where the living and the dead collided. The whispers began again, faint at first, barely audible over the sound of her footsteps. Abigail paused, holding her breath, straining to listen. They were different now, less desperate, more rhythmic like an old chant or lullaby. The sound crawled under her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. She looked behind her, but the tunnel stretched back into the dark, empty. There was nothing, no one, only the voice of the station itself, seeping through the walls like a memory long buried. She pressed on, deeper into the belly of the earth. The tunnel branched in multiple directions, a labyrinth of stone and decay, but Abigail knew instinctively which way to go. It was as though something was guiding her, pulling her toward the heart of the mystery, to the place where the passengers had disappeared. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder with each step. She wrapped her jacket tighter around herself, her breath visible in the light of her flashlight. As she ventured further, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They echoed off the walls, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that made it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Abigail's pulse quickened, and she began to feel the oppressive weight of fear pressing down on her chest. She couldn't tell if the voices were guiding her or trying to lead her astray. Every time she thought she was alone, she could feel them, watching, waiting, just out of reach. And then up ahead, she saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance, barely visible through the darkness. Abigail hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but she knew there was no stopping now. The answer, whatever was lay ahead, she moved toward the light, her footsteps slow and deliberate, the whispers growing almost deafening in her ears. The tunnel opened into a large, cavernous chamber, its walls lined with rusted rails and old wooden beams. In the center of the room was the source of the light, a single lantern, flickering dimly, casting eerie shadows across the stone floor. But it wasn't the lantern that drew Abigail's attention. It was what lay beside it. There, scattered across the floor, were dozens of old, weathered suitcases covered in dust. They were lined up in neat rows, as if abandoned in a hurry, their leather cracked and frayed from years of neglect. Some were open, their contents spilling out onto the ground. Clothes, hats, shoes, personal belongings that seemed frozen in time. Abigail's breath hitched in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. These were the passengers' belongings, the ones who had vanished. Her heart raced as she knelt down to inspect one of the suitcases. Inside was a neatly folded men's suit, worn and faded with age. Next to it, a pocket watch, eerily similar to the one the man at the station had carried. She picked it up, her fingers trembling, and felt an icy chill run through her. The watch was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, as if it had been lying in a grave. She clicked it open, and the ticking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the entire chamber was holding its breath. Abigail stood up, her eyes scanning the room. There was something horribly wrong with this place. The air felt thick, charged with an unnatural energy that made her skin prickle. She took a step back, but as she did, a soft, shuffling sound echoed from one of the tunnels. Abigail froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound grew louder, closer, like the dragging of feet on stone. And then she saw them. At the far end of the chamber, figures began to emerge from the darkness. Their forms were vague at first, indistinct, but as they moved closer, Abigail's blood ran cold. They were the passengers, ghostly, translucent figures, dressed in outdated clothing, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes hollow. They moved slowly, their feet barely touching the ground, as though they were drifting through the air. Their expressions were vacant, lifeless, but their movements were purposeful, as if they were being drawn to something or someone. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The passengers moved in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their mouths open in silent, desperate pleas. She could hear their whispers now, clearer than before, the words twisting in her mind, filling her with a sense of overwhelming dread. "Help us, please, we can't leave." The words echoed in her skull, each voice overlapping, blending into a chorus of despair. Abigail stumbled backward, her mind racing. The passengers were trapped, caught in a loop, unable to move on, just as the man had said. But why? What was keeping them here? And what did they want from her? Her back hit the wall of the chamber, and she realized with growing horror that there was no escape. The tunnel behind her had collapsed. She was trapped, just like them. The passengers moved closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. They reached out to her with skeletal hands, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes begging for release. Abigail's chest tightened as she struggled to breathe. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The passengers were closing in on her, their ghostly forms surrounding her, suffocating her with their desperation. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she heard it, the faint, rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch. The sound cut through the noise, sharp and clear. Abigail's eyes darted to the center of the room, where the man with the pocket watch now stood, his dark coat billowing around him like a shadow. His face was still hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his presence was undeniable, commanding. He held the pocket watch in one hand, the other raised toward the passengers. "They cannot leave." His voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant. "They are bound to this place, as you will be." Abigail's heart raced as the man took a step forward, the passengers parting to make way for him. His eyes, cold and empty, fixed on her with a terrifying intensity. "The station holds them. It will hold you too." She shook her head, panic flooding her veins. "No, I don't belong here." The man's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile. "You came seeking the truth. Now you are part of it." Before she could react, the pocket watch snapped shut with a sharp click, and the room plunged into darkness. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence, and Abigail felt the cold grip of the station tighten around her soul. There was no escape. Black Hollow had claimed her. The darkness was absolute. Abigail stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps as the blackness pressed in from all sides. She could feel the weight of the station bearing down on her, as if the very air had turned solid, trapping her inside its suffocating grip. Her flashlight had gone dead, the last beam of hope extinguished. And yet, she could still hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the pocket watch, echoing in the distance like a heartbeat, steady, relentless. Panic clawed at her mind. She felt disoriented, untethered, as though the ground beneath her feet had vanished. She reached out, her hands brushing against cold, damp stone. She knew the passengers were still there, even if she couldn't see them. She could feel their presence lingering in the void, a heavy, oppressive weight that seeped into her skin. Their whispers had ceased, but the silence was worse, more unnerving. It felt like the calm before a storm, an eerie, unnatural stillness that promised something terrible. Abigail's pulse thundered in her ears as she groped along the wall, desperate to find an exit, a crack in the darkness that would lead her out. Her fingers scraped against the rough stone, but there was nothing, no way out. She was trapped, just like the passengers, in this forgotten corner of Black Hollow, swallowed by the station's unseen force. Suddenly, a flicker of light appeared in the distance. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a pinprick of brightness cutting through the endless black. Abigail's heart leapt in her chest. She staggered forward, her legs weak, her muscles burning with exhaustion and fear. The light was her only chance. She had to reach it, had to find her way out before the station consumed her completely. As she stumbled toward the light, the air grew colder, each breath stinging her lungs with icy sharpness. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the light always just out of reach. But Abigail pushed forward, her determination fueled by the primal instinct to survive. Her mind raced with fragments of the past, images of the passengers' ghostly faces, their hollow eyes staring at her with an unbearable weight of sorrow. She couldn't let herself end up like them, trapped, forgotten, waiting for a train that would never come. After what felt like an eternity, Abigail finally reached the source of the light. It was coming from an old, weathered lantern, much like the one she had seen earlier, but this one was hanging from the ceiling of a small, circular chamber. The walls of the room were covered in soot and grime, and at its center was an ancient, rusted turntable, the kind once used to change the direction of train cars. But the turntable wasn't what drew her attention. Standing beside, it was the man with the pocket watch. He was waiting for her. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as the man slowly turned to face her. His face was clearer now, illuminated by the flickering lantern light. His features were sharp, angular, but his skin was pale, almost translucent, as if he were fading in and out of existence. His eyes, cold and devoid of emotion, locked onto hers with a chilling intensity. "You shouldn't have come back," the man said, his voice low and calm, but laced with something dark and dangerous. The ticking of his pocket watch grew louder, filling the chamber with its unnatural rhythm. It was as though time itself was bending around him, warping under his control. Abigail wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. She was paralyzed, her limbs frozen by the weight of the man's gaze. What do you want from me?" She finally managed to choke out, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. "It's not about what I want," he said, his tone eerily calm. "It's about what the station wants. You see, Black Hollow isn't just a place. It's a prison, a place where time has no meaning, where the dead cannot leave, and the living are drawn into its web. It needs people, souls, to feed its endless hunger." Abigail felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The passengers, they're trapped here. They can't move on because of the station. The man nodded slowly. They were lost in the crash, caught between worlds. The station kept them here, bound to this place, waiting for a train that will never come. And now it's your turn. You came looking for answers, and now you've become part of its story. Abigail shook her head, her mind racing. "No, I don't belong here. I'm not like them." The man's smile was cold, devoid of any warmth. "You were chosen the moment you stepped onto that platform. The station has claimed you, just as it claimed them. And now you're bound to it, just as they are. A chill ran down Abigail's spine. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. There was no escape. The station had marked her, and there was no way out. Her mind screamed for her to run, to fight, but she knew it was futile. The station was alive, a living entity that fed on souls, and she was its latest victim. But something deep inside her, a flicker of defiance, refused to accept that fate. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "You were a passenger too, weren't you? You're trapped just like them. Why are you helping the station?" The man's expression flickered, a brief moment of something, regret, sorrow, crossing his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I was once," he admitted softly, "but I've served the station for so long now. I've become part of it. I am its guardian, its keeper. I'll make sure the cycle continues." Abigail's stomach churned. "You're helping it trap people. You're keeping them from moving on." "I'm keeping the station alive," he replied, his voice hollow. "Without it, they would all be lost, adrift in the void between life and death. At least here, they have form, they have purpose. They wait, just as I do." "Wait for what?" Abigail demanded, her voice rising with desperation. "For eternity? For nothing." The man's eyes darkened. "For the one who can break the cycle, the one who can free them. But no one ever does." The weight of his words sank deep into Abigail's chest. She realized then that the man wasn't just a servant of the station. He was as much its prisoner as the passengers were. And now she was too. But if what he said was true, there was still a chance, however slim, that the cycle could be broken. She looked at him, her heart pounding with a new sense of urgency. "How do I break the cycle? How do I free them?" The man's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You can't. You won't. The station is too strong. It will consume you, just as it consumed me. Just as it will consume the next one, and the one after that." But Abigail refused to accept that. She had come too far, endured too much to give up now. "There has to be a way," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Tell me how." The man hesitated, and for the first time, Abigail saw a glimmer of something human in his eyes. Something that had been buried under years of servitude to the station. He glanced down at the pocket watch in his hand, the ticking louder now, faster, as if time itself was unraveling. "The watch," he said quietly. "It's the key. It binds them to the station, keeps them trapped in the endless loop. If you can stop it, maybe, just maybe, you can free them." Abigail stared at the watch, its gleaming surface reflecting the flickering lantern light. It seemed impossible. How could something so small, so ordinary, hold so much power? But she had no other choice. The pocket watch gleamed in the dim light, its ticking growing louder, each tick like a hammer driving a nail deeper into Abigail's mind. It was as if time itself was wound tightly within its delicate gears, controlling the fates of the passengers, the station, and now her. Abigail stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the man's words pressing down on her. The station thrummed with an energy she hadn't noticed before, a low hum beneath her feet, pulsing with the rhythm of the watch. It wasn't just a forgotten relic of a bygone era. It was alive, fed by the despair and entrapment of those it had claimed. And now, that energy was coiling around her like a noose, tightening with each passing second. The man's eyes never left hers, cold and resigned, as though he'd seen this moment play out countless times before. "If you destroy the watch, you might break the cycle," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But be warned, there's no guarantee of what will happen next. The station might collapse, or something worse could be unleashed." Abigail didn't have time to consider the full weight of his words. She could feel the station closing in on her, its unseen forces tugging at her soul, trying to bind her to this place forever. The passengers, silent, hollow eyes watched her from the shadows, their bodies frozen in the void between life and death. They were waiting for her to make a choice, to end the cycle of torment they had endured for so long. Her hands shook as she reached out toward the watch. The man held it loosely, as if daring her to take it, though his expression was unreadable. Abigail hesitated, her fingers hovering just inches away from the cold, metallic surface. The ticking had become almost unbearable, like a countdown to some unseen catastrophe. "What happens to you if I destroy it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man's lips curled into a sad, knowing smile. "I fade like the others. I've been part of the station for so long. I've forgotten what it feels like to be anything else. I'm a fragment, a remnant of what I once was. Once the watch is gone, I go with it." Abigail's chest tightened with the weight of his words. He wasn't just a puppet of the station. He was its prisoner, cursed to oversee the endless cycle of suffering. There was a flicker of humanity in him, a faint echo of the man he used to be. But she knew there was no saving him. His fate was tied to the watch, just as the passengers were. And hers too if she didn't act now. Without another word, Abigail snatched the watch from his hand. The moment her fingers closed around it, she felt a surge of cold shoot up her arm, spreading through her entire body. The ticking grew louder, faster, as if the watch were fighting against her, resisting her touch. Her heart raced, and for a brief moment, she thought she might be too late, that the station had already claimed her. But then she saw them. The passengers began to stir, their ghostly forms flickering like dying embers. Their eyes, once vacant and lifeless, now glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. They were watching her, their silent pleas for freedom filling the air with a palpable tension. Abigail could feel their desperation, their hope clinging to her like a weight she couldn't shake. "Do it," the man said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos that was about to unfold. "In this." With trembling hands, Abigail raised the watch high above her head. The ticking was frantic now, a sharp, erratic sound that reverberated through the chamber like a storm about to break. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stop, to throw the watch away and run. But she knew there was no escape. Not unless she ended it here. She brought the watch down with all her strength, smashing it against the rusted metal turntable. The impact echoed like a gunshot, the sound rippling through the station, shaking the walls and rattling the very bones of Black Hollow. The glass face of the watch shattered, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. Then, the ground beneath her feet trembled violently, as if the entire station was being torn apart from the inside. Abigail stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest as the walls of the chamber groaned and cracked, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The air was charged with an electric energy, buzzing with the release of something ancient, something that had been bound to this place for far too long. The passengers began to dissolve, their ghostly forms disintegrating into wisps of light that swirled around the room like fireflies caught in a storm. Abigail watched in stunned silence as their faces softened, the agony that had plagued them for so long melting away into peace. They were free, but the station wasn't. The darkness that had haunted Black Hollow for so long now surged forth, no longer contained by the ticking of the watch. The shadows twisted and writhed, growing in strength, spreading through the tunnels like wildfire. Abigail could feel it, the malevolent force of the station, the hunger that had sustained it for decades, now unleashed. It was no longer satisfied with the souls of the dead. It wanted more. The man stood across from her, his form flickering in and out of focus. His face was calm, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes. "You freed them," he said quietly. "But the station, it won't let you go." Abigail's heart sank as the truth of his words settled over her. The station might have released the passengers, but it still needed someone to feed its hunger, someone to keep the cycle going. And now it had her. The walls of the chamber shook violently as the shadows closed in, swirling around her like a living entity. Abigail felt the cold grip of the station tightening around her, pulling her deeper into its embrace. She tried to fight, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. In the final moments before the station consumed her, Abigail caught a glimpse of the man. His form was fading, dissolving into the ether along with the passengers. He gave her one last, sorrowful look as if to say, "I'm sorry." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the dark. The last thing Abigail heard was the faint, echoing sound of a train whistle, distant and haunting, as if it were calling her name. And then, everything went black. Black Hollow had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before her. The cycle would continue, as it always had, with Abigail now part of the station's endless, inescapable story. The passengers might be free, but Black Hollow still had its keeper. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, the ticking of a new pocket watch began.